Welcome. Hello. Hi, this is Debbie Dodds. How are you guys? This is an interesting way to teach. I'm excited. I'm going to be talking about fictionalizing your past and when to do it. I do have a screen share that I'm hoping is going to work. It's worked sometimes in the rehearsal and not other times. But I do want, because I'm going to talk about real life experiences, I want to start off being a little bit real. When I prepared my slideshow, I thought I had an hour. I always prepare extra material. So I basically prepared about an hour and a half of material. And then I realized we have less than a half an hour. So I'm excited that this is going to be available after the fact. So hopefully, if you're interested, you can go back and look at slides and see what I was talking about, because I might have to go through them pretty quickly to be able to get to everything. So let's see if the slides are showing, first of all. Elizabeth, can you check and see if they're showing? Not sure if they are. Maybe, no. Okay, well, I'm not sure if they're showing or not. But so first thing we're going to talk about is fictionalizing your past, and some of the terminology for fictionalizing your past, because there are a lot of, like, I'm sure you've heard a lot of different things: autobiography, Romana Clef, which is one of my favorites, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. One of the other ones that you might hear is creative nonfiction. When I went to grad school, they talked a lot about creative nonfiction. Of course, there's journalism. There are a lot of different types of terminology that you're going to hear for something like this. And they do have slight differences. I don't think I want to spend too much time talking about the differences between them. But basically, you have a little bit more leeway with creative nonfiction than you do with journalism. Journalism tends to be, you need to try to portray everything as it happened. You need to admit if you have gaps in your memory or things like that. So when I was in grad school, I remember somebody was reading a piece and they were talking about what their mother was wearing 20 years ago and her what she was saying. And I thought, wow, they have an amazing memory. I thought I had a really good memory, but they have an amazing memory that they can remember all of these details. And I talked to the instructor afterwards, and he said, well, this is creative nonfiction. So it's okay. You say the things you remember and you speak with authority. So you're using fiction techniques basically in nonfiction. So that is something kind of to keep in mind, that you're allowed to do. It creative nonfiction isn't journalism. And some examples of creative nonfiction. One that I read recently was Educated by Tara Westover, which is definitely more towards the journalism. She talks about things, but then she'll admit she doesn't remember. She'll talk about perhaps her brother remembered it this way and she remembered it this way. Um, the one that I was talking about, that I was like, wow, I can't believe that this person remembered all of these things, was even more acute when I read Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson, because he was high for almost all of the stories. And I realized that there's no way he could remember like all of the details he does. By the way, great book of stories. But he's definitely putting together pieces that he remembers and embellishing a little bit. I went to a talk that David Sedaris did one time, and David Sedaris had just been called out for really embellishing a lot of things. And he's a humorist, so arguably humorists can get away with more embellishments. But he said, my work is realish, and that it becomes kind of a blurry line between, like, well, I've changed a couple names, well, I've amalgamated a character, well, I've really exaggerated or embellished this, or I've used a different setting because it works better. And that's when you start to go into fiction, basically. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the advantages of memoir, nonfiction, creative nonfiction, and some of the advantages of fiction. So in memoir, if you have a burning need to tell your story, to share your story, and to be heard, memoir is a great tool because your audience knows it's real. The genre appeals to and is preferred by some readers. I've heard people say, I only read nonfiction. Um, there's also a value that you have with nonfiction when somebody's really reading something that they know is real, that they're more shocked by it, or it's funnier because they know it's real. This actually happened. Um, Now, you have an authority with nonfiction, which is a double edged sword, I think, because it did happen to you, but you have to be really careful because there will be people who read it and are like, I don't understand that, or I don't know why, because you're not explaining enough. So even though it happened, as we all know, weird things happen to all of us, but even though it happened, you still have to elucidate kind of the reasons why it happened, just like you would in fiction. If you're a speaker, there's an advantage to marketing with nonfiction because you're going to speak about what you know about. So you can potentially have like a marketing edge from nonfiction. Nonfiction can help you heal more from trauma. I've heard from therapists. Sometimes people write nonfiction for a family legacy because they want their family story to go on. Their vanity presses, and I don't like that name, but basically presses that really help you publish a small number of books for your family. There are people who write nonfiction because they want to share their secrets. And as I talked about, like there's a need to be heard. But let me tell you the advantages of fiction, because that's what we're going to focus on now. Is I found when I was writing my first book, which never got published, there was no story arc. I was having a really hard time getting a point that ended and a point that there was a climax because there were just individual stories, which arguably you can publish that, but that's a really hard thing to publish. So when I wrote my second book, which is here, Amish Guys Don't Call, I was planning on writing fiction, actually. And I was writing a sci-fi novel, and there was a character in it that was Amish. And people in my writing group were asking me, like, tell us more about this Amish character. Well, what's up with the Amish? And I said, I'm not writing a book about the Amish. He just happens to be a character. But I started telling them stories about how I almost dated an old order Mennonite guy, and that was close to Amish, and they were really into it. And so I started writing down some of those stories, and I realized, again, no story arc. So I had basically, he asked me out and I said no, and or he kind of asked me out, and that was it. That was the end. So fictionalizing it gave me the opportunity to give it a story arc, to write in characters. And as I got going, I started having a lot of fun with it, and I realized like I didn't have to stick to what actually happened to me. The second real advantage, I think, of fictionalizing is it's not going to upset or embarrass your family members. And I have a lot of family members that are very supportive of me, and I don't particularly want to call them out in certain stories. So I make it very clear in my book that the mom in my book, who's kind of a dumpster fire, is not my mother. My mother's a very good mother, and I purposely wrote her very different so that there wouldn't be those parallels drawn. Um, Also, my mother's a librarian, and you don't want to piss off librarians. Um, the other thing is, you can really use your imagination. And as I talked about when I was writing my book, I had this opportunity to use real life things that I could describe. So there's a pizza place in my book that I actually used to go to when I was younger. Rick's Place is like an under 21 club that's mentioned in my book that I used to go to. But I could also make things up and make up places and characters. So that was really fun for me. I think too, with fiction, you avoid the trap of under explaining that I was talking about before. That sometimes in nonfiction, people are like, "Well, I don't know what to tell you. It happened. It happened to me." Um, that's not really satisfying for the reader. It's not really your job as an author. Your job as the author is to make the reader feel like they're experiencing it or they understand it. And so in fiction, I think you can maybe avoid that trap a little bit. I find fiction emotionally less taxing because you do have that advantage of imagination. I'm not saying it's completely stress free. I was writing a scene one time and I remember I was writing it and I just started bawling because it was close enough to something that happened um, that it did uh, trigger some emotions for me. But I think writing memoir potentially would be even more taxing. Um, you can also have more fun with satire. So I mentioned David Sedaris. A lot of stand-up comics have written books, which are great. Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, um, Mindy Kaling, and I love those books. And they can definitely do a lot more with satire. Now, those are not billed as fiction. They're in that kind of gray area that I was talking about that you can get away with as a humorist, but you definitely can do a lot more with that. You can bill it as based on a true story. So you can still maybe attract some of those readers if there's enough of your story, which I did not do with this book because I really felt there was not enough of the story that was true. That's the way I wanted to go with that. But the book I'm writing right now is much closer to something that really happened to me. Also fictionalized though, and it might have that billing depending on the publisher. An advantage of fiction is you can avoid lawsuits. You can also avoid scandals like the James Fry scandal, which was a big one, I don't know, about 15, 20 years ago, where people call you out on the details that you changed. So, and maybe you're not changing any details, but if you say it's fiction, potentially you can avoid some of those things. You can also have a layer of inclusivity, which is something I grew up in a very white area of Pennsylvania in the 80s. And there, if I'm writing nonfiction, I can't do a lot with inclusivity, which I would want to. So that's a potential benefit. And then also, you're not telling other people's stories, right? You're not telling somebody else's story that they might not want you to tell. If you say it's fiction, it gives you a little more leeway. And somebody just asked about that thin line between fiction and nonfiction. And I really do think it is a thin line. I think it's a thinner line than most of us think it is. So, what I would say about that is there are some techniques. It's actually a good segue into what I want to talk about next. There are some techniques that potentially you can use when you're writing fiction. And so I want to talk about those. And if you use enough of the techniques, I think you're going to be okay. I think that you can potentially call it fiction if you want to. So one of the big techniques that I use when I'm writing fiction is what if. So as I said, Amish Guys Don't Call was based on someone who wasn't Amish, who was old order Mennonite, who asked me to dance a few times. And I was wondering why he wasn't calling me. And then his cousin told me they don't have a phone. They're old order Mennonite. And I was like, ooh, that's okay. You know, I was really gun shy about that. So nothing ever went any further because those two groups, old order Mennonite and Amish and non-Amish people, don't really date. And so my thought was, well, what if? What if we had started dating? What if, these things happen? So you can take something that happened in your life and then do a what if. So the work in progress that I'm working on right now is based on a true story where I met a woman in my neighborhood who turned out to be a Nazi sympathizer. And she was German and she was pro-Hitler. And that was it. When I found that out as a young person, I visited her a few more times, but it never really went anywhere. And so the story is based on what if it had gone somewhere. And so I've embellished it and I've definitely gone over the line into fiction because I've added characters, I've added subplots, I've added stories that absolutely didn't happen. Another thing, which you can do, memoir tends to be big and creative nonfiction, and you can really narrow your focus. So I'm leaving out a lot of things that were going on in my life during that time period, and I'm adding other things in that make more sense to the storyline. That really is a great technique if you want to fictionalize. Um, Obviously, changing the name of someone, that's not fictionalizing, in my opinion. If you just change someone's name, but they're the same character, it's not really fictionalizing. But if you add details about that character that absolutely are not details about the person that you're basing it on, which is something that I'm doing with this book, um, there's also a strategy called the small unit strategy, which one of my teachers told me one time, if you have a male character and you comment on his inadequacies, no man is ever going to think it's him that you're writing about, which I think is very funny. But that obviously has broader implications. So there are things that you can do that somebody reading it won't recognize themselves in it. You're also not tied to the truth, as we talked about. You can give characters different backstories. Hopefully you start to have sympathy for your characters. I always love all of my characters. I'm very defensive of all of my characters. When I see somebody criticizing one of my characters, I'm like, no. Now, I might not have that kind of sympathy in real life for somebody who betrayed me or somebody who hurt me. But once I create them as a character, I see their whole story. And I have a lot of sympathy for them and a lot of goodwill. You can also use another narrator to tell your story. I would really urge you to focus on show, don't tell, help the writer feel the emotion. Focus on the experience versus yourself. And what I mean by that is when you're fictionalizing something, it doesn't have to have happened to you, or your character doesn't have to react the way that you react to that experience. So when you're fictionalizing something, giving your protagonist, whether you're writing in first person or close third, giving your protagonist a different reaction than you would have is a way to fictionalize. Um, Sharing your humanity, which I think is always an important part, but like being vulnerable. Um, One thing that I do to trigger, so if I'm basing something on something that really happened, but I'm fictionalizing it, I do go back and I read old journals. I look at photos and videos. I even go to the point where I visit places. I taste foods that I liked during that time period. I smell things from that area if you can. Obviously, it's hard to travel right now, but like doing all of those things help that nonfiction part of your story come through. And then again, as I said, you can fictionalize it. Having conversations with people who are there is something you can do. Sometimes that can be difficult because people remember things differently than you do. But if you're really committed to fictionalizing it, that can be a great thing because you'll hear somebody else's story. And again, it's not your perspective necessarily anymore. So you can use bits and pieces of that. You can change the setting. You can change the decade. I changed the decade. I grew up, this was set in the 80s, but I set it in a contemporary period. So I had to do, I had cell phones and I had things to deal with, which definitely made me fictionalize scenes. And obviously, you can change the end too, or you can change the middle, or you can change the beginning, or whatever you want to do. So these are all like great advantages and techniques of fictionalizing. And I have a few exercises, and I know I'm getting close to the end, but I have a few exercises that I'll go over. I do encourage you, if at any point you want to talk more about this, I'm very active on Facebook. You can find me on Facebook. I have two different pages. I have an author page and I have a personal page. You can friend me on either one of those. I also respond to questions that you might send me through my website or something like that. But probably Facebook, I'll respond quicker. Somebody wrote, their eyes were watching God. I heard that one of the relationships in the book was based on a real one. So that's perfect example of something that was fiction. She fictionalized it, but Zora Neale Hurston based her a relationship with tea cake on a real relationship that she had. So that's a great example of a fictionalized book that was based on some real life things. So a couple quick exercises. Um, Tell an in real life small story in dialogue, like a script. Try to do that. Tell a story that happened to you, but tell it from an inanimate object's point of view, watching it, or an animal's point of view. Think of a story that happened to somebody that you know, but tell it from a first person point of view. So you're telling a story that you heard as if it's happening to you. Describe a setting that you know well, and then have something that never really happened happen there. And then the last exercise that I had was write a story that happened to you that you know well, but create a character and have the story happen to them. So it's not happening to you, and try to make that character really different from you and have that character react in a very different way. So I think I've got maybe like 2 minutes left, but if any questions, is there ever a point in your fiction where your fictional story wants to pull you in new directions where it completely departs from the factual narrative? Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, I'm going to go to my book because it's easiest to access in my mind, but I have two major storylines. One is a bullying storyline, and one is falling in love with a guy who is raised Amish. That bullying storyline is based on loosely on some things that happened to me when I was in middle school, but we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have social media when I was in middle school, so it was like more old-fashioned bullying. But because I was writing it in a new era, I had this whole plot line of creating a fake Facebook page and everything, which was really fun because I knew I had to incorporate social media into the bullying. And it kind of pulled me in a different direction. It was a very different kind of bullying that my character experienced from the bullying that I experienced. In the one that I'm writing currently, I have a subplot in there that never happened to me. It happened based on a story I heard to somebody else. So that absolutely, I love it when fiction pulls you in another direction. I think that that's really cool. Oh, thank you, Ben. Great exercises to strengthen your empathy muscles too. I think that that's true. I think one of the benefits too of fictionalizing is that you can see things that happen to you, hopefully, from lots of different points of view, not merely your own point of view. So when you're writing memoir, you might be like a little bit tied to your own perspective. I'm thinking of Augustine Burroughs, who I love, who wrote Running with Scissors. He was pretty tied, because it was he was very abused. He's pretty tied to his story with good reason. But it's nice when you fictionalize. It gives you a little bit of a chance to go in a different direction. So I think I have to wrap up, but I'm hoping to hear from some of you, and I would love to hear more about your journeys and what you're writing. So please let me know, and I'm going to sign off now. The Rise of Secular Spirituality in the U.S. with Becky Garrison is up next. I'm sure you're going to have a great time with that one, and I will talk to some of you soon. Bye.